Yes, you read right. The time has finally come. iRacing is a sim racing title that I, in full honesty, thought I would never try. Its aged engine, combined with the most predatory monetization model in the industry, has always made me regard it as something I ethically just couldn't back. While this may or may not remain the case, one of my very kind community members decided to lend me his iRacing account so that I could get a feel for the sort of experience it actually provides. As a result, I packed an immense iRacing session into my weekend, demoing the title across a variety of tracks and cars, some of which I was intimately familiar with, and others less so. The result was a bunch of realizations and aha moments, the likes of which the community was probably waiting on me to have for quite a while. This video will categorically go through those. The first thing you're hit with when you boot up iRacing is yellow. So much goddamned yellow. It's as if the white balance dial broke off on the yellow shift side back in 2008, the game started raking in tons of cash anyway, and nobody subsequently ever sought to repair it. You know what? Screw this. I'm not going to desecrate my or your eyes for the rest of this video. I'm going to manually fix the white balance myself for the rest of the footage. So much better. As a sim racer, obviously the first thing you'll tend to respond to on any new driving sim is its overall feel and feedback to you as a driver. Each sim has its own unique way of conveying the driving experience, with some coming from schools of thought more similar than others. My first ever lap in iRacing took place with the Ferrari 488 GT3 at Spielberg, aka the Red Bull Ring, aka the Austrian GP circuit, aka the Styrian GP circuit, aka whatever the FIA needs it called next. My first impressions were surprisingly solid. The car more or less behaved as I expected. The breakpoints were more or less where I expected them to be, and my driving inputs for the most part were what I expected them to be across the track. That is, until I had my first run-in with iRacing's infamous passenger slides. I very quickly learned where it earned its loving nickname, Ice Racing. But so long as I kept the car within the limits, it generally behaved as expected. There were even a few snaps here or there I was able to save before the car got away from me entirely. The driving feel in iRacing is very elastic and rubbery. In that sense, it reminded me somewhat of both Automobilista 2 and R-Factor 2. While I wasn't expecting this, it does make sense, as all three titles could loosely be said to operate on physical tire models. Some fully in real time and others pre-baked with real-time elements. While it would be a gross oversimplification to say that all three handled alike, there are certain similarities which come out in various situations. One of the big ones is driving on throttle. This is a big area where iRacing deviates from the other behemoth of online sim racing, Assetto Corsa Competizione. Whereas ACC demands exceptionally strict driving, with the throttle only ever being pressed after an apex, iRacing affords you a little more freedom. Like AMS2 and R-Factor 2, getting on the throttle early and rotating the rear end of the car with it doesn't spell the end of the world. Likewise, yeeting it over a high inside curb, while not necessarily kind to your lap times, won't necessarily lead to a broken can slide initiating. This is a facet of physical tire modeling I've always liked. Some of the emergent car behaviors can be really compelling and forgiving in a way you often see in the real world. But then again, they can also lead to very bizarre behaviors, such as in R-Factor 2, seeing aliens drifting the car on throttle at 200 kph well beyond the slip limit of the tires. Or in AMS2, simply getting on the throttle whenever you experience understeer and scrubbing the car back onto line in a way which would be highly inadvisable in the real world. iRacing, of course, is not immune to this. Its preceding reputation talks of the cars going past the limit too easily and dropping into passenger slides, where you simply have no option other than to ride it out. After my all too brief dalliance with it, I can confirm that it is indeed an issue. That aside, overall I was pleasantly surprised by the handling model. Based on what I've heard about it, I expected far worse, and to be honest, I think I know why. It relates to the force feedback. There's no way to sugarcoat this. The FFB in iRacing sucks. It's coarse, grainy, and makes my Fanatec CSL DD feel like the very first firmware and driver I used on my DD1, which felt like a gear-driven base with grain all over the place. iRacing has, on a technical level, one of the worst force feedback engines in sim racing. It operates at a paltry 60 Hz. In contrast, this wheelbase is capable of accepting up to 1000 Hz, only around 16 times more resolution. This core signal requires a ton of filtering in order to generate usable forces. And what does filtering add? Yes, that's right, it adds latency, which the more astute among you likely would have realized by now leads to even more issues preventing the aforementioned passenger slides before they happen. The core force feedback information appears to be absent of any lateral forces, aka seat of the pants effect, hence compounding the limit driving situation even more. Much like ACC, if one is to catch a slip, they're going to be using other cues such as the sound to do it. That said, it's not entirely unusable. After the correct filters are applied and the wheelbase is dialed appropriately, you can generally make it work for yourself. It isn't a complete disaster, but it's far from good or even acceptable given the vast amounts of money iRacing demands its players pump into it. The least they could do is bankroll a single coder to go in and redo the algorithm, much as Sector 3 recently did with Race Room, completely overhauling the feeling and engagement of their simulation. I believe the stock force feedback is one of the chief reasons that many players become disillusioned with the feel of iRacing, causing them to believe the physics are in fact far worse than they actually are. With that being the case, I can entirely understand why it's seen as mandatory by many iRacing heavyweights to run IRFFB. While I had a chance to thoroughly put the onboard force feedback through its paces in my iRacing test, I've unfortunately not had a chance to test IRFFB, and as such, can't report on the effect it has on the sim yet. Once again, I can't help but feel that a sim charging as much as iRacing does should not be relying on third-party software to complete its driver experience. The track quality on iRacing, no matter which circuit I loaded up, was quite good. None of them had that flat aerial LiDAR feel with no surface variation. It felt quite a lot like ACC in that I could pick any track I wanted and get a reasonably good representation of it. There is a very cool dynamic track system at play in iRacing. Much like the live track system in rFactor 2, as you drive around a green track, you will transfer the rubber from your tires onto the racing line. Eventually, that will begin creating marbles on the road as well. They also claim the track dynamically warms and cools according to the weather conditions as well as the cars driving over it. That said, many of the track models in there are showing their age. The curbing at Watkins Glen looks out of date by about a decade, and Spa, Imola, and the Nürburgring are no exception. While the track quality didn't feel quite as nuanced as what Studio 397 have been churning out over the last few years, it was more than adequate for some good racing. Given how much these tracks will cost you per pop, a bit of modernization certainly wouldn't go astray. While it's no Race Room, Dirt 2, or Assetto Corsa Competizione with sounds, iRacing can occasionally hold its own. It's clear that in some cases, sound recorders were sent out to the track to capture the sound of these cars. This adds a much needed layer of authenticity to the driving experience, and when you're paying on a per car basis, certainly helps add a layer of unique identity and satisfaction to the purchase. There's the standard array of diff whines, engine roars, transmission clunks, underbody thunks, curb ripples, and everything else, though it lacks the visceral edge presented by Race Room and ACC's sounds from the interior perspective. Its external levels are quite balanced overall, which makes a lot of sense given that iRacing is essentially made for broadcast purposes. Overall, I would say the sounds are passable, but aren't going to tingle your privates in that visceral way that the interior Audi R8 diff wine and race room is going to. No points for guessing why this is one of the last impressions. Yellow fever aside, the graphics in iRacing are nothing to write home about. While it's been impressively updated for a title from 2008 to be still playable in 2021, it doesn't hold a candle to a modern simulator such as Assetto Corsa Competizione, or even the original Assetto Corsa after it's been spruced up with CSP, Soul, and all the other good stuff. iRacing have been gradually modernizing the engine with elements such as physically based rendering shaders to make surfaces look more realistic. This is certainly going a long way toward retaining a broadcast quality look for the title, though it's still not going to stand out and wow anyone in the same way the Madness engine might. I'd wondered for a while where to nestle this comment, whether it's more applicable to the physics or the graphics. But given I had so much to say about the physics, yet comparatively so little about the graphics, I figure it could go here in order to pad out this section. One of my litmus tests for sim racing titles is how realistic the motion of cars looks from the exterior view as they move under load. This is in fact what initially sold me on R-Factor 2, as I'd never before seen that level of flex and contortion in a race replay. Likewise, the external behavior of cars in Automobilista 2 can look very impressive, if not a touch overstated and, hyper-realistic. iRacing seems to hit the ideal middle ground. It doesn't portray the bouncerama of Automobilista 2, nor the high-speed drifting of R-Factor 2, yet it also doesn't remain so conservative as to make the cars look like they're floating over the track like Assetto Corsa Competizione. From the exterior view, the races look compelling, with the cars moving and swaying as one might expect when they're racing hard. Doubtless, a lot of effort was put into the external presentation of iRacing in order to make it widely marketable as the idyllic online broadcast platform for sim racing. Now, if someone would just fix that bloody white balance slider. Amazingly, it just so happened that during the weekend I was testing iRacing for the first time, a buddy of mine was running a community race. Thus, I managed to test out how the faithful MX-5 fares in door-to-door racing across the treacherous Alton Park and Mount Panorama circuits. Much to my dismay, the collision calculations and netcode were, for the most part, great. When bumping into each other, the cars behaved as expected and allowed some very close racing. This is at odds with what I'd heard, and it was a little disappointing given that I went in gung-ho to completely tear iRacing a new one here. Obviously, my experience racing only in a single class of car can't be considered definitive, and I'd need a lot more experience here to form anything resembling a conclusive opinion. Disclaimer aside, the online experience was very fun, and it's obvious that much of the focus of iRacing, if not the vast majority of it, lies here. I didn't get to dive into the ranked ecosystem whatsoever, so this review continues to mostly focus on the core driving experience. Wyerman, you paramount paragon of objectivity, I hear you say. How can you dedicate an entire section just to the Nordschleife? Well, dear viewer, you clearly don't know which channel you're watching. The Nordschleife not only got me into sim racing, but also ranks as one of the great loves of my life, so of course it's going to get its own section. Heck, I could even give it its own video series. For now, we'll just have to settle with the one lap. In order to break up the scripted pacing of this video, I want to inject an uncut, full lap of the Nordschleife here. Namely, my first ever lap of the Nordschleife in iRacing. A special occasion to be sure. It was the first timed lap I drove after completing the outlap from the pits in a car I know very well, the Porsche 911 GT3. This car and track form a very special combination. Not only because they often win the N24, but also because they test several aspects of the physics engine of a sim. The high curbing puts an exceptional load on the physics engine to render the limits of car behavior correctly. The wide variety of corners essentially renders just about every potential situation a car might encounter. Meanwhile, the car itself, being uniquely rear-engined, allows us to test for off-throttle rotation, mid-corner corrections, traction under power, and last but not least, fully sick gearbox whine. So let's have at it. Alright, starting the lap, coming up to the new Sabine Schmitz curve, you can already see I'm balancing the car, lots of mid-corner corrections, that rubbery feel I spoke about in iRacing really coming into its own. Bear in mind, this is my very first lap in this car on this track in iRacing ever sans the outlap. Massive push down through into Hudson Buck. You can see I'm already feeling the limit of the car. It's extremely intuitive based on the, well, possibly thousands of virtual laps I've done here over time. And one thing I was tremendously impressed by here with iRacing is how well it handled limit feel, how well it handled limit driving, how well it allowed me to actually sense the parameters of the car as it was guided all around the Hudson Buck sector. So coming up to Flugplatz now, heading out all the way straight, I'm using all the experience I know driving this in R-Factor, driving it in AMS2, driving it in AC, and it's all applying very effortlessly and very naturally. I've yet to overpush the car, I've yet to feel like I've pushed it past its limits. If anything, I feel like during certain situations the car has too much grip, if anything. Alright, so heading down here into Heusinkveld, car, a little bit of a lift off the throttle there, hard on the brakes, coming down to Arenberg, pushing quite hard. You can see lots of mid-corner corrections, feeling for grip. One thing that this game has, head and shoulders above ACC, is the ability to feel the limit slip mid-corner to allow you to adjust. Even without that seat of the pants sensation and the force feedback, it still just makes you feel like you're there. It's way more engaging. Dropping down to 5th, flying over the curb there, coming up into Adenauer Force now, slowing well down. Seeing what the car does at slow speed here. Touching the curbs, using the extremes of the track, no problems with curbing in iRacing. It handles curbing, no worries. One of the hallmarks of most of the physically modeled tire simulators I've ever driven is they have fairly good curb behaviors. Still feeling for that limit well into Sector 2 here. Now this is where things start to get exciting, of course. This is where the turns get a little bit more cambered, a little bit more exciting. As I push out of the exit there, using almost all the curb on the exit. Extremely high curbs here at the Nürburgring really allow you to feel the car's behavior at the limits. Pushing through, hit, miss there, quite hard actually. The car is instilling confidence, even here into the slowest corner of the track. Just push right in, grab a bit of the inside curb, and again, well, correcting for the slip on the exit. Again, car very communicative there at the limit. One of the very strange things about iRacing, on one hand, yes, you have those passenger slides, but before you get to the passenger slide, you feel like you have all the control in the world. Once again, very engaging driving style. I have to say, all bias aside, I felt very engaged driving the 911 here at the Nordschleife. It's something that I found myself wanting to do again and again and again, even just by myself, to see how much I could improve on my lap time. Coming up here into one of the largest power sections of the track, of course, mostly uphill. Get a feel for the PBR shading of the track as the sun is about to bounce off the surface of the road. You can see probably a better PBR implementation than that of R-Factor, I've got to say. Track looks somewhat less washed out, even with iRacing's very aged graphics engine. Coming up here, literally just letting off the throttle, letting the lift-off oversteer do all the work for us. I was advised that you would not experience much lift-off oversteer on the Porsche, however I found that wasn't the case. I drove this much as I expected to drive it. Braking, very powerful actually. I find the brakes to be a lot more confidence-inspiring in iRacing than many other sims, so that's another point to its advantage. And coming up into the carousel for the first time, how easy will it be? Very, very easy to keep it in the carousel. Another hallmark of the physically modeled tire sims, I generally find. Very similar to the feel of that of AMS2 in the carousel. Now coming up into Sector 3, my absolute favorite section in all of motorsport. Going to be very, very exciting. Flying uphill. Absolutely threading the needle there. Using the curb at the extremes, feeling for grip mid-corner, pushing the car in. Using a hybridized R-Factor and AMS2 driving approach. Able to absolutely munch those curbs on the inside there through Whipperman, car sliding out on the exit. As you can see, you can drive it to the limit. Again, you absolutely can drive it to the limit. It's just about when it goes past it. That feather edge of when it goes past it, but I've yet to reach that on this lap. I'm just feeling it out, just surfing the car right at the very edge of its adhesion to the road. And that's really where the joy and the fun of sim racing is, in my opinion. Oh, pushing yet again, flying over the inside curb, as you would in real life, of course. No weird, jagged, curb bouncing behaviors, the like of which you would see in AC and ACC. Now flying down towards one of the most terrifying sections of the track, all flat out down here, car adhering to the track surface very well, jumping, dipping into the cambering, and drop a gear, turn in, use the aero, have confidence in the car, and again, I go wide, unfortunately, I get understeer on the exit, I go out, and on the limit, car still manages to recover itself even off the grass. Mini carousel, no worries. And this is one area that was a little bit different to most of the other sims I've driven. Now, coming back here, you normally have to coast and then gradually get on the power, but I absolutely floored it here, flat out on the throttle, still managed to catch the exit, didn't go wide on the exit. That seemed a little bit too confidence-inspiring for me, but coming out onto Döttinger Höhe here for the first time, I mean, I feel pretty good. I feel pretty good about the lap. I actually can't believe how close to the edge I managed to drive the car on my very first outing on the track. I felt like I've done this hundreds of times before, which I've got to say, all bias aside, is a feather in the cap of iRacing. I mean, all the things I've heard about its driving model, surely I should have had a lot more trouble doing my first lap of this track in this car that I know oh so well from other sims, but the experience wasn't all that different. Now braking hard here coming up towards the end of the track. Just feeling for that grip, and yet again, last corner, here we go, pushing out wide, using all the track for one lap of the Nürburgring Nordschleife. Well, what better way to conclude this video than with a lap of the Nordschleife in a 911 GT3? What more could I really add to that you didn't actively experience with me in there? My high school teacher would slay me for this, as I was told to never introduce new information during a conclusion, but I just can't help myself. I have to give a very special mention to the menu and control setup wizard, which makes setting up the controls for the car as well as the force feedback an absolute breeze. While it's not the next level UI that Race Room brings to the table, it's certainly a lot better than some others. Given my expectations going in, overall I was somewhat pleasantly surprised by iRacing. It didn't blow my mind. It had drawbacks where I was told to expect drawbacks, and just like every other sim, it has its strong points and its weak points. It's certainly not the silver bullet, hyper-realistic solution the developers or their indoctrinated cultists would paint it as. However, it's also not the awful mess that some of the others who flee to Race Room, ACC or R-Factor 2 would try to paint it as either. One thing it definitely does seem to be is way overpriced for what it provides. Sans the curated online ecosystem, there is nothing especially revolutionary about driving in iRacing. It can be fun, sure, but it can also be frustrating, and needlessly so at that. If the developers were ever to see fit to rewrite their force feedback engine, fix the tyre behavior at the limits, modernize their tracks, decide on whether they want to charge a subscription fee or a content fee rather than both, and finally, bloody de-yellow everything, I might consider delving into their ecosystem and giving it a proper good bash. If you enjoy iRacing, more power to you. Far be it for me to tell anyone what to do with their time or money. But for the time being at least, you probably won't see me racing door to door with you in Yellowland anytime soon. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, become a member to get cool perks, check out the links below to get sick gear that'll get you driving godlike Nordschleife laps your first time around, and of course until the next one, I'll see you all later.